I've been looking forward to doing this video for a very long time. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one that can say this year has been really fucking shitty. I'm sure millions of people would agree with me on that one. It was especially rough on me due to things like not being able to go to school and having to resort to very unorganized online classes and homework, having to completely change from a gym to a home workout, and many other personal issues that have plagued my mind this year. So amidst all this, and once the situation got under control in my country and we went back to quote-unquote normal, there I was sitting on my chair wondering what the hell was I going to do to pass the time. Work on my animation that I had to have published months ago? Nah, future me will take care of that. Work on some art? But I have tons of homework, plus I do that every day anyways. And so there I was, really getting those gears in my head turning until it dawned on me. There was this game that I had been aching to play for a long time, a very long time. An action game with tons of sword fighting, interesting dynamic between protagonist and antagonist, who also is a sword fighter, absolutely incredible music and a great story and characters. That game was Devil May Cry 5, and don't worry, I will make a video on it, it's very much in my plans. But today I'm here to talk to you about a different game, although very similar in nature. In fact, I will be comparing the game directly with Devil May Cry plenty of times throughout the video. The game I'm here to talk to you about is Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. If you know me, you know I'm a giant fan of DMC, but if there's another great Japanese franchise of video games that I also happen to love, it's Metal Gear. I initially began playing Metal Gear around 2017, with Peace Walker being my first game on the PSP. I didn't understand shit about it back then, and I didn't really pay much attention to the game either. I just liked to play it, and I only really knew the Metal Gear franchise by name. Sometime after that, I began to seriously play the Metal Gear Solid games. Well, the ones that I could anyway, finishing with Metal Gear Solid 5 Phantom Pain, which remains as one of my favorite Metal Gear games simply due to how extensive the gameplay options are. Around those times, I also happened to play Metal Gear Rising. Although my memory of it is really fuzzy, I distinctly remember posting a screenshot on Facebook celebrating that I had beaten the game in less than 11 hours, and although I don't remember much of it, I remember having played it. Recently, thanks to the power of the YouTube algorithm, I began to encounter myself with more and more Metal Gear Rising content. And so I thought it'd be fun to revisit the game after not only having played the entire Metal Gear franchise, but also after having played similar games like DMC and Bayonetta. And so after a long time without making videos, I bring you my Metal Gear Rising Retrospective.
Tool of Justice.
Around the time Hideo Kojima and the team behind Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots began wrapping up in 2008, Kojima immediately got to thinking about ideas for a Metal Gear Solid 5. Initially, he thought of doing a game with the boss and her Cobra unit, and so he got a couple ideas and gave them to his team of developers at Kojima Productions. However, because Kojima was working on other projects at the time, the team rejected the idea of working on this game without his direct supervision. However, someone would propose the idea of making the next Metal Gear game be about Raiden, and so Metal Gear Solid Rising would start development. The idea behind the game was to allow players to do what Raiden does in the cutscenes of MGS4, and the game would be placed in between MGS2 and 4. One of the main gimmicks of the game was that since Raiden wields a sword, anything in the game could be cut, something reflected in one of the early trailers for the game. This proved to be quite difficult on a technical level for the developers, however they were excited to work on a brand new game without direct help from Kojima. However, as excited as the team was, the reality would soon hit them, and they soon began to realize that the project was not coming together at all. The developers would hit a wall without being entirely satisfied with how the story and the gameplay flowed, and seeing how they couldn't balance the stealth and action, time was running out, and they had nothing but a few fun mechanics and a very unfinished early product. One of the producers would be contacted by Kojima, who stated that at this rate, the project would never be completed, and that they were missing a director who pulled all of them in the right direction. Kojima at the time was working on the Fox engine and Peace Walker, and so he only acted as a producer without having really anything to do with how the game was being written or developed outside of casual supervision. However, after finishing Peace Walker and peeking to see how the project was doing, Kojima realized that although they had made some progress, the game design itself was still lacking, with the developers not knowing exactly how to balance the traditional stealth of the Metal Gear franchise with the action gameplay they were going for. Kojima was more than ready to cancel the game outright, and for some time it was, but he really liked the ideas that the team had, they just didn't have the game design down. Kojima began to look for teams of developers abroad, but he soon decided that an action game with ninja and samurai themed characters and weapons would better fit a Japanese studio. And so the salvation for the Kojima Productions team came in the decision to leave the project in the hands of Platinum Games. Platinum Games being a video game company formed by key members of previous companies like Capcom's Clover Studio, who later went by Seeds Inc. after it went defunct, and Odd Inc., with one of its founders being the famous video game director Hideki Kamiya, the father of Devil May Cry, director for Resident Evil 2, Okami, Beautiful Joe, and probably its most famous creation, Bayonetta. Working alongside Platinum Games proved to be refreshing for the team at Kojima Productions, seeing as the artistic vision of Platinum Games developers was very distinct from their own, and the way they carried their stylistic action in their games was very unique. Likewise, the team at Platinum Games praised the developers for Kojima Productions for their attention to detail to everything. Kojima would later realize that many interesting ideas surged from this merge of developers, and so eventually the game would be remade from the ground up entirely, now being set after Metal Gear Solid 4, giving them vastly more room to explore new settings and more importantly new characters, essentially cementing Raiden as his own protagonist of his own story with his own set of enemies and sidekicks. And so with both teams very eager and excited to work alongside each other, Metal Gear Rising would be revived from its near-death experience and come back better than ever. With this new game design and focus in mind, the project would no longer be called Metal Gear Solid Rising, and it would instead be changed to Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. The game takes place after Metal Gear Solid 4 in 2018. Although at the end of MGS4 the entirety of the Snake's backstories were wrapped up and the Patriots were defeated, the war economy was still very much alive, with information from the Patriots being leaked everywhere, especially their cyborg data, which gave birth to a new era of not only cyborg enhancements that we see throughout the entirety of Rising, but also mass-produced robots and AIs. Raiden now works for a private military company called Maverick, who focuses more on security than anything else. In one of Raiden's missions, he and his target get attacked by two members of a cyborg organization named Desperado Enforcement. Raiden attempts to save his target, and he not only fails to do so, but he also loses his arm and his left eye after an encounter with another swordsman called Sam, who leaves Raiden bleeding out. After a couple weeks, Raiden gets sent to a mission to deal with a coup d'etat happening on the territory of Abkhazia, which was brought upon by the same PMC who attacked him, and so not only following his orders, but also out of revenge, Raiden is more than willing to accept the mission. Earlier I mentioned how I would be comparing this game to Devil May Cry a lot, and if you're not familiar with either game then you'd ask yourself why. Well, the answer is very simple really. Due to Kamiya and Platinum Games being involved in the game, Rising has a very similar style to Bayonetta, and as a result it also has a very similar style to Devil May Cry, due to these games being all about stylish action, combos, and ranking systems, as well as similar mechanics in game. Although, due to this game being part of Kojima Productions too, this vision could not be fully realized. As I stated before, the game suffers a lot from this weird mix between stealth and action, without fully getting the most out of either playstyle. And with characters directly encouraging Raiden to be as stealthy as possible all the time, even though this playstyle directly affects the player, since big action-packed fights are the ones that reward the most battle points, which are the currency with which the player can buy outfits, new weapons, enhancements, and skills. This causes a very weird dissonance with what the gameplay wants the player to do, but what the characters want the player to do. Although the gameplay is torn between these two things too, since if you do areas in a stealthy way, the characters will congratulate you, and this does cause a special ranking where you get no alerts and no damage on the level, but going all out and having fights with enemies and reinforcements, that's what gives you the most battle points, which are ultimately the most useful thing in the game. Fortunately, aside from that, the game works perfectly fine if you just go through it like a normal stylish action game and just kill everything that is in your way. Same thing goes for doing everything in stealth instead of going all out in action. Some sections work best for stealth and some work best for the action approach. Stuff like how much noise you create with your footsteps isn't a problem, as I found that you can pretty much run towards opponents and kill people near other people, and they won't even bat an eye. Kinda ironic how they're supposed to be enhanced humans, but they're still pretty oblivious. The ninja run is also a pretty useful tool that will allow you to not only sprint through levels but also parkour over some obstacles in your way, which makes progression through the levels somewhat easier. It's a pretty cool addition, although sometimes it can be very clunky to control and kinda hard to know when you automatically jump over obstacles and when you just don't. The game is more similar to Bayonetta than it is to Devil May Cry, due to the game having light and heavy attacks instead of a single attack button, although in similar fashion to Devil May Cry, different attacks can be made by waiting a bit after attacking. And similar to Bayonetta, you can do strings of combos and different moves by combining different inputs, which makes for very fun and fast-paced attacks and a very diverse combat system. Unlike Bayonetta and DMC though, this game offers you a defensive option, in which you can block an incoming attack. Although this isn't a perfect block unless you can time it correctly, think of this as the Royal Guard mechanic in DMC. If you perfectly block an attack as it's about to land, you can then counterattack and leave enemies open for a Zandatsu, which leads me to the next mechanic of the game. One of the most famous mechanics of this game is its blade mode, which can be accessed by a meter that fills up under the HP bar, in which you can access a mode where you can cut enemies with horizontal or vertical cuts with the light and heavy attack inputs, or freely cut in any direction that you wish with the camera stick or the mouse, which is very fun to do and very useful in many boss fights. Although without plenty of enhancements, it's very hard to nail down exactly the cuts that you want to do due to how fast it depletes. So for the most part, if you want to just get some damage or you just want to really cut someone to atoms, you're better off just spamming the light and heavy attacks for cuts in all directions, which essentially is the same thing. Some enemies will become entirely blue or will have some limbs become blue, which you can then enter blade mode and cut however you'd like and essentially dismember the enemy, which admittedly is tons of fun to do, and some enemies will have special left arms that contain Patriots information, which you can cut off for special rewards if you get enough of them. A mechanic that is very fun to pull off, which is tied to this, is the Zandatsu, which allows Raiden to take fuel cells after cutting a specific area on a weakened enemy and replenish your blade mode meter and your health to maximum. A mechanic that you unlock later on in the game is the Ripper mode, which can be accessed when your blade mode meter is full, and when accessed, you can essentially defeat normal enemies in a couple hits only, and you can bypass enemy armor very easily. Works very similar to the Devil Trigger mode in Devil May Cry, in which your offensive skills increase dramatically. While you're in Ripper mode, you can also access Blade mode whenever you'd like, even if the Blade mode meter is not fully charged, which essentially allows you to cut down as many enemies as you want until the meter depletes, and recharge it with enemy fuel cells for essentially an infinite Ripper mode. To spice the game up, you also have access to many sub-weapons and items that allow you to replenish your health and Blade mode meter, with the weapons being mostly rocket launchers and grenades, which was a little bit of a shame because I honestly would have loved it if you could actually shoot machine guns and such, but I suppose it just wasn't the focus of the game to do that. Your blades work perfectly. And yes, I did say blades. You have access to boss weapons after defeating bosses that allow you to use their weapons as a secondary with your heavy attacks. I found the use of Mistral's boss weapon to be the most fun. With this weapon you have access to a variety of AoE attacks that can target multiple enemies at once, which is very fun to do since it's very easy to get surrounded in the game, at least in hard mode. Monsoon's weapon acts as Nero's Devil Bringer from Devil May Cry, basically allowing you to get close to enemies and fly towards them, which is very handy for enemies that get away. Sundowner's weapon allows you to do very heavy but slow attacks that hit super hard. I didn't find this weapon to be particularly fun, but it's great if you can manage to pull off a strong attack against armored opponents. The fact that you can access all of these weapons is very cool, although accessing the menu where you can change the weapons and items is very weird. Basically you have to not be moving or attacking at all, otherwise you cannot access the menu. It's very weirdly implemented. When playing as Raiden, you can access this sort of eagle vision sort of thing where you can see where enemies are and where items and breakable objects are. It's pretty cool, although it kinda sucks that you can't run with it being activated. It would have been a cool thing to just let this be purely manually activated or deactivated, instead of forcing you to get out of this. Especially because some sections that greatly encourage stealth require you to use the famous cardboard box, but you cannot access this mode while in the cardboard box, which is your only means of staying hidden. So once again, this is a very cool addition, but it's very clunky. You'll notice that I mentioned when playing as Raiden before. That is because Rising has two extra missions, one in which you play as Jetstream Sam and the other in which you play as Blade Wolf, but I will touch on these a little later on. I played the game in hard mode, and although it was extremely challenging at times, for the most part I was fine. although sometimes you get swarmed with enemies and it can be extremely difficult to deal with. Since, although this game is similar to DMC, in DMC whenever you get swarmed, it's usually by lower ranking enemies that you can easily dispose of, and around 1 or 2 tough enemies to kind of give you a hard time. But in this game you can get swarmed by pretty tough enemies all at once. Fortunately, the weaker ones can immediately get disposed of via Zandatsu, but the tougher enemies cannot, and you usually need to drop their health low enough to cut their limbs, or parry them, and then you get a chance to instantly kill them via a quick time event. It sure is a shame that this game doesn't have a health bar for enemies. They could have added a health bar on the lock-on, but they didn't do that. It's very hard to tell when enemies are close to dying and when they have full health. Sometimes enemies died on me and I kept on making combos and wasting movements because I didn't know they were gonna die. So a health bar would have been very useful actually. Although for the most part enemies were fine, there's 2 enemies in particular that I always found extremely unfun to fight. I don't know their names, so I'll just show them on the footage in the background while I talk, but these enemies are a hell to fight against. One of them always shoots fire at you and always runs away, and if you get close it will spin around, and only after I played through the entire game did I realize that you can insta-kill it by parrying its attacks. But even then, it's hard to manage if you have a shitload of enemies around you, especially if some of them shoot rockets. It's just overall a very shitty enemy to fight against. The other one is more about how difficult it is to fight against, especially if you're fighting against more than one. These guys are fucking relentless. They hit super hard, and they have yellow attacks, which basically means that you cannot block the attack and it's a grab, so your only option is to dodge. But it's super hard because not only is dodge a skill you gotta buy, but even when you are dodging, I always find it super hard to actually dodge to where I want to dodge. And if you're fighting against more than one, forget about even landing a single hit. You're gonna be blocking the entire time without any window to get a single combo in. It's legitimately frustrating. It's not impossible though, of course, and Reaper mode trivializes these guys super fast, but it's still an annoying enemy that is absolutely relentless and forces you to get more defensive, but it's not a fun implementation of this character. On the other hand, there's these guys with giant hammers that will block all of your attacks and force you to think more strategically about how to approach them. These guys are a great implementation of an enemy that hits hard, doesn't go down easy, but still gives you plenty of windows to attack and get combos in. You just have to be smart about it. The bosses of the game are absolutely stellar. There's not many, but the ones that are there are amazing and memorable as fuck. It's very hard to forget about the very first boss fight in the game being a fucking Metal Gear Ray, the kind of enemy that would usually be the last boss of a typical Metal Gear game. But fuck it, this time around is your tutorial boss. Here you go, figure it out. The fights all have their own little gimmicks, and while they're all mostly just a fight to the death, there's some strategy involved, and you have to be pretty quick on your toes to make use of your full arsenal, and to really gain an advantage over the bosses. Some bosses even have enemies that will appear alongside them, so you have to be extra careful and manage many enemies at once. Like the fight against Mistral, in which there's many dwarf geckos littered around the arena, which will prove to be a big nuisance if you can't get them out of your way, especially since they can grab you and leave you defenseless to Mistral's attacks. At the end of almost every boss fight, and sometimes at the middle of it, you can get some pretty fun quick time events which will either do a ton of damage or end the fight outright. I'm usually not one to like QTEs, but knowing this comes from Kamiya's direction and having played Bayonetta in the past, I don't really mind it that much. They're pretty harmless anyway. At the end of almost every fight, you pretty much cut your enemies to pieces, but they still get a couple final words in the form of a codec call, which is pretty funny considering that, you know, there are a pile of cyborg bits on the floor, but I guess I'll let it slide. It makes for a fun visual at least. And before I forget, in classic Metal Gear fashion, you have a codec mechanic which allows you to talk to your teammates and save your game. Nothing that affects gameplay that much outside of being able to save and access the customization screen. But it's a staple of the series at this point, and it's pretty well implemented. It's pretty cool that even on scripted codecs, you can skip the dialogue. Unskippable cutscenes or dialogues are a pain in the ass for veteran MGS players who just want to play the game and not wait 30 minutes till the characters stop talking. And of course, let's not forget about VR missions. Throughout the levels, you will encounter Desperado computers, which you can interact with to get access to VR missions, of which there are 20 scattered around the 7 chapters of the game. Honestly, I'd be surprised if they didn't include VR missions for this one, considering a world with cyborgs and AIs all around is pretty much the perfect setting to include VR missions on. The difficulty of this game is no joke. I thought that I'd be able to handle it pretty well on hard mode, and while I managed to do nicely and I got some nice A and S ranks and first tried a couple boss fights, make no mistake, the game is pretty hard. One of the highlights of my playthrough was the final fight against Armstrong. Right next to Virgil in DMC5, this guy is probably one of the toughest fights I've ever had to face in any video game. That may sound ridiculous, but for some reason this guy just kept kicking my ass. Admittedly, I basically had to do a no damage run because I had no healing items whatsoever, but still, super tough fight. I had to go back to a previous level and start using a trick to farm healing items, and only then could I go back and win the fight. I never had this much trouble with any other boss in the game, or any boss in any game for that matter. Fortunately, unlike DMC and Bayonetta, using healing items on Metal Gear Rising doesn't really lower your rank or anything, so that's pretty cool. Hell, even the Metal Gear Ray in Sam's campaign gave me a bit of trouble due to how action-oriented that campaign is. Which leads me to talk about the DLC campaigns for Rising, starting off with Jetstream Sam's campaign. This campaign takes place before the events of Rising and details how Sam became affiliated with Desperado. Sam's campaign is oriented more towards pure action rather than the mix of stealth and action of Raiden's campaign. While the gameplay mainly remains the same, there's obviously some changes that make Sam a pretty unique character to control. Sam doesn't have access to an enhanced vision like Raiden since he doesn't have any cyborg enhancements at all. Instead, he does a taunt when you press the D-pad. His taunt makes the enemies become angry and attack harder, but in return you can also attack them harder too, which makes it essentially a risk-reward mechanic. Sam cannot ninja run like Raiden, although he can double jump and do unique attacks while running, which are pretty cool. By holding down your heavy attack, you can also charge up an attack that will deal tremendous damage, although you are defenseless while doing so. You can charge this attack up in the middle of your combos for different moves. This alone trivializes most enemies in boss fights due to how overpowered it is. Sam really feels like playing as the boss character. He is a very powerful character to control, and it's a joy to play as him. Nothing much can be said about his campaign other than showing us a bit of Sam as a character and how he eventually joined Desperado by losing his arm against Armstrong. I guess now he knows why they call him... Nah, that pun is terrible, I'm not even gonna finish it. Blade Wolf's campaign, on the other hand, is... well, it's similar to Raiden's, but it's mostly built towards stealth. Just like Sam, this campaign shows us what Blade Wolf was doing and how he was like before meeting Raiden, as well as showing us where he is at the end of the game. This campaign, like I said, is mostly built towards stealthier gameplay. Although Blade Wolf can fight, stealth is the route I took. As Blade Wolf, you will mostly play through VR missions with some casual platforming, which is pretty neat to do, admittedly. Although after these you will play through some levels that occur before Raiden arrives in Avcasia, in which you will have to escape the area. There's one obligatory boss fight at the end, which is pretty cool. The character here is a new one that you don't see on the base game, and the fight is really fun. But other than that, the rest of the campaign really encourages stealth, and boy is it fun to pull off. Unlike Raiden, when you stealth kill as Blade Wolf, the game doesn't slow down to give you time to enter Blade Mode, it just keeps going. I can't tell you how many times I became so bored of stealth killing as Raiden, because the game just kept slowing down after every kill. But not here. Honestly, it's kinda weird they didn't take it away from Raiden's campaign, but I suppose they wanted to give you plenty of time to enter Blade Mode, even though you can perfectly enter Blade Mode with time to spare if the game didn't slow down. Whatever. These DLCs are great. They're only a mission long, so it doesn't take much time to complete, and they're separate and unique enough to make them worth it. If anything, I'm just sad that there wasn't more to these two. But again, Rising is a game that is pretty short with only 8 missions, so I guess it's better that way. There's not much to say about the soundtrack of the game, other than it's completely awesome and that it's very, very different from what you'd hear on a typical Metal Gear game. Having a more electronic metal sound this time around, which honestly complements the gameplay incredibly, and is one of the things that make it similar to Devil May Cry. Slashing away at enemies with this soundtrack is one of the most satisfying things ever, and even more with the boss music, which is very good and has amazing lyrics too, touching subjects like freedom, war, corruption, and others related to that. Rising's music as well as the gameplay were at first received sort of mixed by the community due to them being too different from what the usual Metal Gear game is known for. But over time, the community not only warmed up to every aspect of Rising, but most of it turned into memes like Rules of Nature's lyrics and Nanomachine's Son, to name a few. Being a short game has its advantages though. It doesn't overstay its welcome and doesn't bombard you with so much stuff and information that by the end of the game you don't even remember what the problem at the beginning was. The plot is not hard to remember at all. After the prologue, Raiden keeps working with Maverick, going around the world doing missions that coincide with Desperado's plans. And after discovering a connection between World Marshal and Desperado and their horrifying plan to harvest child brains and turn them into soldiers, Raiden quits Maverick and pretty much attacks World Marshal by himself, culminating with Raiden having to travel to Pakistan to fight against the leader of this whole operation on top of a Metal Gear who also happens to be candidate for president for 2020? Yeah, this is getting ridiculous. So it's not too far away from your usual plot in a Metal Gear game. And actually, now that I think about it, it's not the first time Raiden fought a US president. Being a Metal Gear game, it places high importance on themes and characters. This time around, the cast is almost entirely new and original, with the main character obviously being Raiden and his teammate Maverick. There's nothing much to say about these characters, unfortunately. They're fun and they're there almost the entire game, but they don't have the same level of personality as other characters like Colonel Campbell, Mei Ling, Otacon, Kaz. They're alright. Possibly one of the most memorable characters from this game is a boy that you save in like the 3rd chapter from being murdered in the sewers of Mexico. And the reason he's so memorable to me is because of the way he speaks. I thank the devs for adding 2 subtitles for him because otherwise I honestly would not understand a single word from this kid. Sonny also makes an appearance near the end of the game. It's really heartwarming to see these 2 characters back together again, although unfortunately they cannot spend a lot of time together due to circumstances, but it's nice to see Sonny is doing okay. The characters that are by far the most interesting are the main antagonists, the members of Desperado. These characters have really good designs, boss fights, and personalities that are very unique. It's not surprising that characters like Sundowner, Sam, and Armstrong are fan favorites due to how charming they can be, even if they are batshit insane. These antagonists aren't only there to stop Raiden in his tracks, but they also mess up with him mentally too. Throughout the game, Raiden will have internal conflicts about his indiscriminate killing of PMC soldiers. To Raiden, he's just reaping the fates of these soldiers who have already made their choice by being terrorists or killing innocents. That is, until Raiden gets called out on his bullshit when Sam confronts him about this later on and tells him the truth. The truth being that these soldiers pretty much have no other choice. In a world where war runs the country and the economy, people like the guys that Raiden kills have no other choice than to become soldiers full with cyborg enhancements and nanomachines that restrict their emotions so they can earn a living and support their families. And to add salt to injury after this revelation, Raiden is then forced to kill even more policemen while listening to their repressed fears and emotions. Really putting into perspective just how much doubt these people have in themselves and how much they fear going against Raiden. Something that breaks Raiden, which causes him to become emotionally and physically weak, reflected through the gameplay by making Raiden unable to run or attack at all. He's pretty much struggling to even stand up. Monsoon kicks it up a notch by having a philosophical talk with Raiden about nature and memes. No, not those memes. Memes as in the term coined by Richard Dawkins from his book called The Selfish Gene. Memes are basically ideas or behaviors that get passed down through imitation and culture, a way of carrying ideas or practices from person to person through things like speech, writing, gestures, rituals, which is why it's compared to a gene due to the way it acts and self-replicates. But the important part about this whole encounter is that Raiden finally comes to terms with his nature. He enjoys killing. He was raised as a child soldier, so that's part of him. That's his meme that he carries. Fortunately, a thing that is mentioned in the selfish gene is that while there's quote-unquote good and bad memes, the bad or undesirable memes can be identified and therefore eliminated, something that Raiden ends up doing himself by wanting to save children and refusing to let George learn how to kill. He's essentially identifying that while his meme of killing gives him joy, it's obviously wrong and he wishes not to pass it on. He doesn't want more children to become what he has become. And so he goes full fucking insane and well, I'll let this iconic scene play out.
Forget the devil inside. But who am I kidding? I was born to kill! The bit about my sword, that means of justice stuff, I guess I needed something to keep the Ripper in check when I was knee-deep in bodies. You? But you. All this is a wake-up call to what I really believe. What I really am.
What are you saying?
I'm saying Jack is back.
Doctor,
pain inhibitors.
What? This is madness. You
Do it!
All right.
Pain. This is why I fight. This is my normal. My nature.
You've lost your mind.
And while Monsoon already defeated thinks that he passed one of his memes of enjoying slaughter to Raiden, I find that not to be true since Raiden himself recognizes it as wrong and does not want to pass it on. Ugh, I told myself I wasn't going to analyze this game's plot and here we are. What makes these characters interesting is that they all have similar backgrounds to Raiden. Having known war since a very young age, it touches a very deep spot in Raiden's heart and makes him doubt and question himself. Sometimes even the player doubt themselves. But make no mistake, almost every single character in this game is fucking insane. While the things they say may sound logical at first, it's all justifications for their ridiculously cruel acts, like Sundowner for example. He uses the excuse that kids are cruel to justify his love for chaos and destruction, but at the same time knows that kids are easy to mold and turn into killing machines. One way or another, they all have cracks on their beliefs. Except for one character that managed to fool people even outside the video game. A character that managed to convince the players that what he was doing insane may actually not be that bad at all. None other than the main antagonist of the game and final boss, Senator Stephen Armstrong. At the end of the game, after defeating Sundowner, it's revealed that Armstrong is about to assassinate the current president while he's on a visit on Pakistan and put the blame on rebels and terrorists to ensure that PMCs would be once again in high demand so he could jumpstart the economy back again. Raiden gets there with nearly less than half an hour via an RLV supplied by none other than Sonny, who is working at a private spaceflight company named Solace. When Raiden gets there, he immediately runs towards Armstrong and they converse as they fight and their ideals clash against each other. At first, it seems like Raiden is completely in the right here. Armstrong is about to do insane things, all for his own economical gain, until Armstrong flips the script. He reveals that he's not doing this for his own economical gain, but rather so he can get elected and become president, so that he can finally put an end to war economy and create a world where people are truly free and fight for their own beliefs, rather than what they're told to fight for. All of this, coupled with the things he says, makes for interesting points and makes him out to be this very sort of heroic figure who just wants everyone to truly be free. The problem starts when you remember that this is a dude that is completely alright with having children being subjected to torture, having their brains harvested to turn them into cyborgs, and also wants to create a wasteland where the strongest fight for their beliefs and crush the weak under their feet. A person who was born with money and never had to struggle to survive, someone that doesn't know what that's like, the effects that it has on a person's mental health. Sure, Raiden may be the perfect example of Armstrong's philosophy, a person who does not care about laws or morals and does things the way he sees fit throughout whatever means necessary. But we're talking about a person who is deeply broken by the horrors of war, and even if Raiden wasn't, he still fights for the freedom of others who cannot fight like him. Despite even Raiden calling him out for being legitimately insane, Armstrong still managed to convince real players that what he was pushing for was the right thing. Very few Metal Gear antagonists, actually very few video game antagonists in general, managed to do that. So to me, that's actually an achievement for the game. The game doesn't really have a happy ending for Raiden, let's say. Raiden not only ends up having to kill Armstrong, saying nothing at all while Armstrong's life is snuffed away, but he also ends up abandoning Maverick for good to go fight his own war. The game sets up a sequel that would probably never come because Konami, and I can only assume that Raiden ends up traveling the whole world doing the same thing Sam did before him, taking down PMCs one by one in the hopes of finally putting an end to the war-driven world he lives in. If I had to put into a single word what the theme of the game could be, I would say it's all about freedom. From Monsoon thinking that we're slaves to our memes, to Sundowner thinking that we're slaves to our morals, to Armstrong thinking that the entire US population and soldiers are slave to whatever bullshit they're subjected to, be it fighting for other people and being controlled by social media, to Blade Wolf, who is literally a slave of Desperado being unable to act on his own and wanting nothing but freedom, something that can be seen more in depth on his DLC, in which he's essentially forced to do things with the threat of having his memory wiped otherwise, and the rest of the campaign being all about Blade Wolf attempting to escape before they catch him so he can be free. Sam is the only odd one out. He's sort of special. Sam starts off pretty similar to Raiden. He not only took down a drug cartel in Brazil for revenge, but he also went around the world doing similar things to whatever criminal organizations and gangs he could find. That is until he got his ass kicked by Armstrong, which made him realize that his quest to take down corruption on his own, bit by bit, was flawed, and he could not do it. That's when Sam started to change and stopped caring about ideals, and only desired to serve and fight, and that the winners decide what is right and what isn't. Alongside his taunting personality and the mystery that surrounds his character, it's no wonder he's a fan favorite. Something that I sort of applaud the game for doing is making the player doubt themselves about what they're doing. Raiden does everything he does for the sake of others, but is that really why? Or does he just enjoy killing other people? In my opinion, I don't see Raiden as an evil guy simply because he knows what is wrong and what isn't and fights for what he believes to be right, but he's not entirely an angel either. No one is in the world of Metal Gear, except for Otacon and Sonny maybe. Metal Gear Rising may be very different from your usual Metal Gear game from the soundtrack to the gameplay, but at the core, it's still very much a Metal Gear game. The story and characters do not take a step back to allow the gameplay to shine, they both shine equally as much. It may not have the same amount of iconic and characteristic side characters as other games in the franchise, but they're memorable enough, and the story deals with the horrors of war as much as any other Metal Gear game. My only complaint really is that we don't really have a closed ending and it's left up to speculation what actually happened to Raiden. Despite that though, I believe the story works great for what it set out to do, and I'm really glad I played Metal Gear Rising once again after so many years. Metal Gear Rising was an entirely different thing when compared to its predecessors, and even its successors, with Metal Gear Solid 5 releasing 2 years after Rising. I feared that people would still look at Metal Gear Rising as this spin-off title that should be disregarded as non-canon and hated for being a dumb cash grab on the action genre and for ruining Raiden's ending in 4. I was one of those people at first. I absolutely hated the idea of Rising. I mean, have you seen this? This is not Metal Gear at all. But of course I was only looking at the surface. At the time I wasn't into games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. At the time I probably would have thought that these sorts of games were entirely dumb, but then I gave it a try and I loved it, and I give it another try now after being exposed to DMC and Bayonetta, and I'm in love with it even more. Despite sharing traits with those types of games, Rising is still a Metal Gear game through and through, at least to me. And I'm glad to see that throughout the years, people have went from mostly hating the game, to making memes about it, to loving it just as much as they love the rest of the franchise. I've even seen people now in 2020 asking for a sequel to the game. Unfortunately, a sequel to Rising seems nearly impossible. After Metal Gear Survive, I don't think there's any way to revive the franchise unless it's handled by someone other than Konami, and we all know that they're not gonna let that happen. It's a shame, really. If for whatever reason you haven't played Metal Gear Rising, I would recommend you to play it, and if you already have, then play it again. It's truly an amazing and addicting game, and it's very short, so it doesn't overstay its welcome and doesn't drag longer than it needs to. Despite the troubles that plague the development process, Platinum Games and Kojima Productions managed to deliver a very unique Metal Gear experience while still keeping its core values intact, and not only did they deliver a great game, but also a title that will not be forgotten anytime soon. And I hope that with this video I managed to do the game justice and expose to more people just how awesome it is. I'd like to thank you if you watched the video until the end. You have no idea how much it means for me. I have been putting off the making of videos due to personal issues in school, but I'm done with all that and I'm back on track now. And I have ideas for tons of videos, plus animations, and more projects on the future. As always, I remind you all that aside from YouTube, I'm also an artist. I'll leave my links in the description for you to follow me if you wish to see what I do. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.